Hello and welcome everyone. I can see the numbers rising as people join. That's lovely. I'm just going to wait whilst everyone joins before we get started. I hope those of you that attended the conference yesterday enjoyed the sessions that you went to. I'll do a proper welcome in a moment, but I can just see that lots of people are still joining. So. Okay, so as it's 10:01, I shall get started because I know we've got a huge amount to get through. So welcome everyone to day 2 of our conference. It's an absolute delight to have you here, both the audience and the panellists. Like I said just now, we hope everyone that was here yesterday enjoyed it. So our first session today is chaired by Rosie Lewis, who's Head of Policy at Imkaan, and we'll discuss how active anti-racist practices are being embedded in organisations led by and for women and girls. And we'll consider what racial justice means now for our sector. So you don't need me to tell you that the pandemic has brought into focus stark racial inequalities, amplified by the global Black Lives Matter movement and countless examples of racial injustice highlighted across the UK and the world. It's absolutely vital that the women and girls sector embeds proactive anti-racism into everything that we do. And hosted by Rosie, this session is designed to consider what that means for us and actually how it can happen. So a few logistics: we will finish at 11:20 today, ahead of the next session, which starts at 11:30. The session's being recorded. We will have a 5-minute break in the middle after all the talks and before the Q&A discussion. If you do have questions for the panellists in the chair, which we really hope you do, please put them in the Q&A box. And please do introduce yourselves to each other in the chat box. It goes without saying that we're going to be considerate to each other. And yeah, like I say, questions in the Q&A box would be lovely. And then Rosie has the lovely job of chairing a discussion at the end. So without further ado, I will hand over to our wonderful chair, Rosie. Rosie Lewis is Head of Policy at Imkaan. But after a decade working at the Angelou Centre. So Rosie, over to you. It looks like Rosie might have frozen. Oh, she's disappeared. Oh no. Right, I'm going to hope that she comes back in. Oh, technology. I'm going to give her a couple more minutes to come back in because I know that she's prepared her introduction and I don't want to take over. What I'm hoping is that she'll rejoin. I can see people all chatting to each other in the chat. That's lovely, thank you. Rosa, who's behind the scenes, have you heard anything from Rosie? Is she likely to come back on?
I haven't heard anything. I would maybe what you could maybe, oh no.
I think maybe I'll introduce our panellists.
Yeah.
So with us today, we have Rosie Lewis from Imkaan, although actually right now we don't have her, but I'm hoping she'll rejoin us. We have Dania Thomas from Ubuntu, Gisela Valle from Latin American Women's Rights Service, Andrea Simon from the End Violence Against Women Coalition, and Adwoa Kwateng-Kluvitse. I'm sorry, Adwoa, I'm sure I said that wrong.
That's all right, don't worry.
UK. Could you tell me how it's said?
Just go with Kwateng. It's easier.
Okay.
Adwoa Kwateng. Yeah.
Okay, so I know that Rosie had prepared an introduction, and I'm sorry that she's not here with us to give that introduction. I'm not sure which of you she was going to ask to speak first. Can you? It was Dania. Okay, brilliant. Dania, I'm going to ask you to take off for us, if that's all right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll go straight in. So we are a Glasgow-based specialist by and for Black and minority women-run shelter dedicated to meet the emergency needs of women with no recourse to public funds. We are trans women and sex worker inclusive. Thank you, Rosa, Anna, for arranging this wonderful panel, and Rosie for chairing. I'm sure Rosie's spirit is in the room. As we speak across the country, specialist services like ours are under attack. We are critically endangered in a climate where intersectionality has become a four-letter word, and seeds of discord and hate are being sowed. This stirring of racial hatred and interracial conflict is a strategy of a callous and incompetent state aimed to distract and divert attention away from its actions. At this moment, it means a lot when the voices of the women we support are platformed and amplified. We thank the fund for your support of our work. A few weeks ago, I dropped Mary, not her real name, one of our pregnant short-term guests, to a new mother and baby unit set up in Glasgow in January this year. This unit houses all pregnant mothers. Some of them moved out of their flats and some with small children. Most of the women come from Namibia. Grassroots movements in Glasgow have challenged this newfangled creature of the hostile environment, and there's been no change so far. When asked, a spokesperson of the housing provider said, and I'm quoting, "The mother and baby unit in Glasgow is a new dedicated facility. The aim is to provide accommodation along with access to healthcare and other support services that is designed to best meet the needs of mothers and babies. The facility has been refurbished to a high standard. Rooms have private kitchen facilities and all are en suite." It almost sounds like a holiday resort. So I would like to present a short spoken word piece to reclaim the dignity and the humanity of the women and their babies in this unit. A room of one's own. They said that she will be here until lockdown was lifted. But now Mary must stay till her baby is 2 years old. They have never asked for her consent or offered her a choice. They have said that this is good for her and her baby, and that this is exactly what she wants. Mary's bedsit is clean, no clutter, scuff, photographs or paintings on the smooth magnolia walls, no bookshelves or bric-a-brac, no space for memories from home. There is a grill that covers the radiator on the wall. "It's best to be safe," the lady said. "The windows with no curtains overlook a flat roof and cannot be opened fully. There's enough space to let some air in," the woman said. What she did not say is that Mary cannot be trusted to take care of herself or her child on her own. This bed set is measured precisely. 2 steps to the wall from the bed on the narrow side and 4 steps to the cooker on the broad side. The patch of linoleum floor between Mary's bed and the cot in the corner is gray, darker than the sky outside. There's some cutlery and 3 stacked one-person non-stick pots, a sink, a dustpan and brush, a shower at the far end, 10 small steps from her bed, far from a holiday resort. "She will be happy here," the lady said, "as there are many rooms with many mums and many babies from her country. She will feel at home," she said. What she did not say is that the unit is cost effective. What she did not say was that all these Black bodies are from the same country And if their cases are rejected, they can all be processed together and deported in one cheap chartered flight. What she did not say was that the Home Office awarding the housing contract awarded it to the bid that offered best value for money. What she did not say was that Mary's humanity and dignity had no value to them. Mary does not have papers and must be grateful to get housed in a holding cell, a breathing pen, designed to efficiently extract value from the bodies of a Black woman and her unborn child. Like every square meter of linoleum, every moment of her experience as an expectant mom, every heartbeat of her unborn child is precisely monetized to deliver profits, dividends, and influence. This unit is part of the border security prison industrial complex, where community and cultural spaces in our neighborhoods are being hollowed out, retooled, and refurbished into 21st century factories. Mary's bedsit is how structural violence looks like in our time. There is violence in the symmetry of gray linoleum and magnolia. The straight lines and blank walls discipline and contain. There is violence in a space designed for obedience and deference, a space designed to kneel, not stride. There is violence in small pots that cannot hold the spicy okra and fish stew with pup that soothes Mary when she is overcome by memories of her mom and her 2 children she left behind. This violence does not leave marks nor bruises. This violence does not reveal a perpetrator, but is evidence of unspoken crimes against Black and brown bodies almost unchanged for over 400 years through slavery, colonization, indenture, and now the hostile environment. Make no mistake, in this structure, our freedoms come from her confinement. This cost-effective unit is how Preeti Patel saves our taxpayer money, and the Home Office builds back better. This hostile environment is designed to make us hostile and implicates all of us. At Ubuntu, with every woman we support, we resist this implication. With every woman we support, we say no, not in our name and not on our watch. With every woman we support, we repay a historical debt with our care. A Room of One's Own is an extended essay by Virginia Woolf, which is part of the English literary canon. Here, Woolf carefully unpacks a woman's yearning for a space of her own to think free from a disruption of a man's expectation and his needs. Ubuntu Women's Shelter, the Angelou Center, and a Bonch House run by Safety for Sisters, and other specialist by and for services across the country believe that this is an inalienable right of every woman, irrespective of their status. We give our women a room of their own. For a short time, we offer them a space free from the normalized violence of patriarchy, racism, and poverty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dania, and thank you to all of the women at Ubuntu Women's Shelter and the resistance and the work that they do every day, day in, day out, just to survive, but the way that it actually gives strength to other women everywhere. So thank you so much for giving that, for really setting the picture and the lived reality and the lived experience and material reality of the women and children that many specialists led by enforced services are supporting. So we know racism is embedded in the social and political consciousness of the ongoing British Empire, and it's enacted through the structural racism, immigration policies, and hostile environment that, as you've outlined, Dania, many Black and minoritized women and migrant women are living within. I'd now like to introduce Gisela Valle, who's going to be talking more specifically about a police super complaint that was brought together by Liberty, Southall Black Sisters and Latin American Women Rights Service. And she'll be talking a lot about the way that racism is structurally embedded within immigration controls. So I'll hand over to you, Gisela. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. So I'm going to try and go through this presentation and have a bit of ground to cover as quickly as possible. And I hope this does not detract from the information that I'm going to be presented. The Latin American Women's Rights Service is a feminist and human rights organization run by and for Latin American migrant women. We have over 37 years of experience supporting the practical and strategic needs of migrant women exposed to discrimination on the basis of their gender, race, and immigration status, and to violations of their fundamental human rights. As part of the strategic work that we do policy advocacy and campaigning on violence against women and girls and labor rights within the framework of minoritized migrant women's rights. And actually, I use a lot the term migrant women, but what I'm referring specifically is migrant women coming from the global south who are minoritized in this country and treated accordingly. As part of our policy work, we lead the Step Up Migrant Women campaign and coalition of over 50 women's, migrants, and human rights organizations. Migrant women are one of the most invisible, marginalized, and disadvantaged groups in the UK. Although it is widely assumed that migrant women enjoy the same rights and protections as other women, the reality is that they're routinely denied services, protection, safety, and justice on the basis of their immigration status. This leaves them vulnerable to be targeted by perpetrators of domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, exploitative employers, unscrupulous landlords, and others who are able to take advantage of this vulnerability. For women who find themselves in these situations, the precariousness of their position is reinforced when their immigration status becomes the basis to deny them basic rights entitlements, trapping them for longer in situations of violence and abuse and leaving them few options to escape it. Although immigration law and policy are often presented as neutral, they disproportionately affect Black and other minoritized communities and compound other structural inequalities that disadvantage them. This system, the immigration system, is complex, geared towards facilitating the loss of status and presenting considerable barriers to regaining it once lost. Taking this into consideration and based on our experience as a specialist frontline service, we developed a campaign and coalition to address the specific needs of migrant women. This has allowed us to campaign for amendments for migrant women in the Domestic Abuse Bill, now Act, as well as supporting as a coalition the presentation of the first police super complaint on data sharing by Southall Black Sisters and Liberty. However, the general position in both processes from the government to acknowledge the structural inequality that affects migrant women in favor of supporting an immigration system that continuously contravenes their human rights has demonstrated that there is still much more work to be done in this area. For the many women who experience the effects of these inequalities, the refusal from the government to fully protect them constitutes another form of violence and a denial of their full humanity. In order to explain this more fully, I would like to give a very broad overview of the disadvantages that are inherent to being subject to immigration control, the super complaint, and its links to the Domestic Abuse Act. The first step to understand the challenges facing migrant women is to have a better understanding of the system in which they have to exist and how it creates structural barriers for anyone who is subjected to it. To exemplify this, I will rely on a very short, brief summary of some of the findings from the Windrush review. According to Windrush, the immigration system is so complex that even Home Office personnel struggle to understand it. Standards of evidence to demonstrate status have become higher and the process more complex and costly. Successive changes to legislation have increased barriers such as the setting of fees exceeding administrative cost of processing visa applications, and in the majority of the cases, far exceeding the cost of the process of the visa applications, and significant restrictions to appeal rights at some point from 17 to 5. So it's a really strong reduction on any chances of appealing decisions by the Home Office. High fees, coupled with the absence of fee waivers for settled status, trap poor migrants in repeated cycles of leave to remain applications, preventing them from settling permanently into the country. And changes to legal aid have disproportionately impacted ethnic minorities, including migrant communities. Within the immigration system, there is a general presumption that people may be lying about their immigration status, and maybe in most cases are lying about their immigration status, even when there is no corroborating evidence that this may be the case. The Home Office has generally assumed a much broader equalities duty exemption than it has, meaning that the legislation and policy have been introduced with a lack of impact assessments on vulnerable people and minorities, and without any racial monitoring to shed light on the effects of this policy and practice. Finally, and perhaps more worryingly, within the Home Office, there is a general lack of understanding and awareness of indirect discrimination. Considering this context, it's highly unsurprising that violence against women and girls affects migrant women disproportionately because of the risk factors that precipitate the violence intensify, and barriers to safe disclosure and reporting become more complex. Migrant women wait much longer to report violence and abuse, with about 1 in 5 not reporting it at all. They experience a unique form of coercive control based on their insecure immigration status, and over half of them are afraid of not being believed by the police because of this immigration status. Finally, migrant women are disproportionately marginalized due to the overarching effects of the hostile environment, which by virtue of turning a vast group of people into border guards, open the door for discrimination at a much wider scale. Migrant women experience more barriers to access services and support, including refuge accommodation. In effect, this system creates two tiers or two categories of survivors: those who are supported and protected by the state and those who are not; those who are vulnerable to specific forms of abuse, such as manipulation of their immigration status, and those who are not; and those who can be abused with a high degree of impunity, and those who are not. Although this division is on its face based on neutral immigration rules, the fact is that these rules have a disproportionate impact on Black and minoritized women. For example, according to information provided by the Home Office in the context of the Super Complaint Review, the majority of survivors of domestic abuse whose information is shared with immigration enforcement are confirmed to have status, which, in the absence of data related to their race or ethnicity, presents a problematic picture of whose information is shared and why. In December 2018, Liberty and Salho Black Sisters presented the first ever super complaint covering two features of policing. The first is the data of victims and witnesses was being shared by the police with the Home Office for immigration enforcement purposes. And the second is that the police was prioritizing immigration enforcement over the investigation of crime and safeguarding. The concern was that these actions deter victims and witnesses with an unsettled immigration status from engaging with the police, which denies justice for victims and accountability for perpetrators and harms the public as a result. 2 years later, the report of the Super Complaint found that effectively the police and Home Office are not able to assure communities that they serve all people coming into contact with them, that they will be treated fairly and safely, and that allegations of discriminatory behavior are not proven unfounded. This is because there are no records reflecting the proportion of victims and witnesses separated from perpetrators whose data is being shared. Sharing information between the police and the Home Office on victims and witnesses of crime with insecure immigration status is a common practice. And although it is not clear that the purpose of this data sharing is immigration enforcement, it does appear that this information may be used for this reason. There's a general lack of awareness in police forces about the implications of this data sharing and the immigration enforcement actions that might take place as a result. There is no evidence that sharing of personal victim data between the police and the Home Office supports any kind of safeguarding of victims of domestic abuse, and that as a result of all of this, significant harm is being caused to the public interest. The recommendations of the Super Complaint were an immediate stop to sharing information on domestic abuse, which we have had confirmation has not happened in the time between December last year and now. a review of the legal framework and policy underpinning the matters raised in the super complaint, and with the aim of providing clarification to police or public services and immigration authorities on the priorities regarding all migrant victims and witnesses of crime with insecure immigration status. The super complaint also recommends consideration of a mechanism for establishing a firewall between the police and immigration enforcement for all migrant victims of crime with insecure immigration status, and the development of a safeguarding protocol between the Home Office and the police to guide responses to this cohort of victims and witnesses. The protocol should reflect the realities of this group of people, as well as draw on the experience of the relevant specialist organizations that support them. They also recommend to take steps to ensure that all migrant victims and witnesses of crime are effectively supported through safe reporting pathways to the police and other statutory agencies. And finally, there's a real need to improve the data on the information shared, in particular, the status, ethnicity, and nationality of people referred or inquired about to the National Command and Control Unit within Immigration Enforcement, in order to understand and record whether the caller who is sharing this information believes that the person is a victim, an offender, or both. And this is a necessary step to assure the public that victims and witnesses are treated fairly and equitably, regardless of their protected characteristics. Now, the super complaint is a separate issue or a separate process from the domestic abuse bill. But as a result of the campaigning work that we did around safe reporting and all protections for migrant women, the government introduced two compromise amendments, one of which is the requirement that this review of the recommendations of the super complaint should be laid before Parliament. Obviously, this is in no way addressing the real needs of migrant women, but at least it puts some pressure on the Home Office to do a much more decent review than they did with the migrant women review during the passage of the bill. In the protection of migrant women, the other proposal from the government was the introduction of a pilot project to assess the needs of migrant women with no recourse to public funds, in spite of the amount of evidence that exists within the sector, what the needs are and how they can be met by specialist services. Although the compromise amendments gave that statutory footing to review and the recommendations from the super complaint, we believe it was a missed opportunity to provide the much needed certainty that migrant survivors have for access to services, safety and support, including by ensuring safe reporting mechanisms on a statutory footing. This in turn further entrenched the existing two-tier system for survivors divided along the line of immigration status, and disproves the government's assertion that migrant victims of violence and abuse are treated as victims first. The super complaint will likely continue during the second half of this year with a view of having final recommendations or the report by the Home Office at the end of the year. So we will continue working in partnership with Southall Black Sisters, Liberty, and the other members of the Step Up Migrant Women Coalition to see it through. In this work, there might be another possibility to work on the needs of migrant women with the upcoming Victims Law, which we're very pleased to see that the Victims Commissioner included in her policy paper the issue of migrant women, and specifically the issue of safe reporting mechanism. Although we understand there's a lot more that needs to be done in order to ensure some degree of equality. In this context, I'm just going to add two very brief points. We believe that there is a need to have more specialists by and for BME and migrant women's organizations accessing more spaces to represent their communities, as we believe there is a need to have greater diversity in the policy advocacy and campaigning arenas, particularly with decision makers at all levels. It really makes a difference to have the frontline services, for example, presenting the cases that we get to see, and particularly how fast they come through the services when there's any change. I believe that the super complaint led by Southall Black Sisters is a good example of the difference it makes to have the by and for services leading on these specific issues. Finally, just on a point, we will continue supporting women who have direct experience of the effects of this intersecting structural inequalities to have platforms to advocate and push for the change that is needed. At Lords, we have experienced the transformative power that this can bring in terms of agency, empowerment, and growth to the women themselves, and we have been incredibly fortunate to work alongside remarkable activists during the debates on the domestic abuse bill. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gisela. So the power of that super complaint it's just it's incomparable in terms of what's going on and how it's being rolled out. But what's really, really important for everybody who's attending here is to think about how that's going to be implemented in terms of safe reporting. So we really, really welcome any questions you might have about that process, anything that you want to share about your experience of working with migrant women who are going through these particularly problematic structural these obstructions that are absolutely being put deliberately in the way of women's right to safety, protection, and freedom. So we are really welcoming many questions today, and if there's anything you want to put into the chat to share, either as you could be a frontline worker, you could be an organisation, you could be somebody who's here and wants to share their experiences. I really doubt that there's anybody here who is from a women's organisation who doesn't support a woman who's been touched by the issues that have been raised. But I think what we all have to ask is, and question ourselves in the work that we do, or the community work that we do, is what we're doing to make a change and support those women, because it's very, very easy to turn a blind eye or to not know or to not get involved. And I think a key part of the work that we have to keep doing in the feminist women's sector across the board is that we have to keep making sure that women's rights are at the heart of everything that we do, and that's every woman's rights. So this kind of gets onto our next speaker, Andrea Simon. So we know that anti-racism is at the heart of our led by and for Black minoritized specialist services. And it's part of that work that we do as Black feminist practice and organisations and the way that we operate as organisations. And it's an absolutely pivotal part of that rights-based work. And it's often being done in really difficult contexts in regions around the country. And it's very, very different depending which region or locality that specialist service is in. So we know that COVID and the murder of George Floyd exacted this kind of level of societal response to broader issues around racism. And there was a response from the women's sector, about better supporting, at baseline racial equity, if not racial justice. But we also know that structural racism is something that doesn't end when we start working in the women's sector. And often we know as Black minoritized women's organisations that we're often having to ourselves as organisations deal with a hostile environment. So Andrea's going to talk about an anti-racism charter that's been developed by a group of organisations for the violence against women and girls sector. And it really describes that work of a shared framework for dismantling everyday and structural racism. Andrea Simon is director of the End Violence Against Women Coalition. That's a leading coalition that provides support for 100 women's services, researchers, activists and survivors and NGOs who are working to end violence against women in all its forms. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you, Rosie. And I think Anna's going to help me with some slides I've prepared. Brilliant. Thank you. So Rosie's introduced me and what I'm here to talk about today. Thanks. If you can go to the next slide, please, Anna. So I want to start by briefly discussing how this anti-racism working group was formed and the purpose of our work. So the working group has its origins in a weekly violence against women and girls sector call that's been taking place since the COVID-19 outbreak a year ago, more than a year ago. Now, following the murder of George Floyd, numerous charities quickly moved to publish statements of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and asserted commitments to fighting racism. But how much of this was performative and not sort of really actually intended to lead to examining and progressing institutional and structural change was something that was quite strongly felt. In discussing the violence against women and girls sector's response at a meeting, we resisted the move to issue a statement, and instead a smaller group of women were tasked with forming the Anti-Racism Working Group, which began on a journey of designing a charter with a set of anti-racist standards for our sector. And we know that within the charity sector and the wider social justice movement, Black and minoritised women have challenged how organisations can claim to stand for feminism, can claim to stand for equality and justice, while failing to truly tackle structural racism within the sector and within their workplaces. Systemic racism shapes how Black and minoritised women experience violence and abuse and their access to safety, support and justice. And structural inequality is regularly reproduced through our sector through things like inequitable funding, unequal power and partnerships, the appropriation of specialist services that are developed by Black and minoritised women, and the continued failure to ensure that Black and minoritised women are treated equally within organisations and represented in leadership and governance structures. So what we really wanted to do with this work is to move beyond the performative and into action that would really tackle the injustice and racism that is experienced within the sector. We also recognise that in doing this work, we're very much in a broader context, as has been discussed already, of a hostile environment and a government backlash on anti-racism. One incredibly concerning example of this being the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparity report, which came out earlier this year, which denied and discounted structural and institutional racism. This hostile context makes it more important than ever for organisations to stand up for social justice and equality. Challenging racism in our sector, we understand, requires building a movement. It won't be achieved by one organisation or even a small group of organisations alone. We felt this working group was needed in order to kickstart that action and open up those conversations and that opportunity for change within the VAUG sector. We ourselves are a small group. We're not currently fully representative of all parts of the sector, all parts of the UK, all experiences of violence against women and girls, and recognising those limitations, we are working to try and review our scope and structure to ensure we address these gaps. Now, before I go into the charter and its content, I think there are parallel stories to this. There's the charter itself, but there's also the creation of the anti-racism working group. And the process of doing that, I think, is a very interesting story to be told as well. Now, our regular meetings as a group became a safe and necessary space for group members to have the kind of frank and uncomfortable conversations about racism that we need in order to make progress. It became a space to express frustrations, sadness, anger, as well as to exchange ideas and work on the strategy, the policies, and to think about how we can sustain the momentum and attention to anti-racism in ending VAUG work. It has seen us need to do this work both in separate Black and minoritised women and white women spaces, and then to return together to one space to share with shared expectations and shared ways of working. And for me personally, it was a new experience to be centred in the creation and maintaining of a space for discussion and action on racism, which was safe for Black and minoritised women. It enabled the challenging systems and structures of white supremacy to be discussed openly without fear of individuals' responses to this challenge. That became central to the way the group worked, as well as the work we were doing. It was also very present for us that we held each other accountable to ensure that we were going to deliver meaningful change within this sector and not allow a return to business as usual. It's been a real privilege to work with the women on the group and to see our ideas developing into reality. And learning a huge amount along the way. Since we formed, we had a call to action on the 10th of December, Human Rights Day last year, and we received over 200 sign-ups following that from organisations across the UK. We had had a series of consultation events earlier this year in February where we talked to VAUG organisations, by and for Black and minoritised women's organisations, and those organisations that also work on the intersection of VAUG and other issues such as migrant rights. As an opportunity, use this as an opportunity to find out more about how the charter would work and to discuss some of the issues that organisations have in engaging with it. Go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to be summarising how some of our values underpin our commitments to achieving some of the actions in the Charter. So we've got core values of accountability. If we want to centre anti-racism in our work practically, we need leadership and governance to do this, and that to demonstrate direct accountability. Organisations of all sizes can develop best practice in the area of doing things like monitoring and reporting on diversity, equity, inclusion, and then they can follow up with developing targets to tackle the kinds of issues that are being identified. Black and minoritised women within white-led organisations have documented institutional racism, barriers to progress, and a lack of safety, trust and respect. And an anti-racist approach would ensure that there's effective procedures are in place for reporting and addressing racism and scrutinising and changing organisational practices that lead to Black and minoritised people being treated unequally. The value of fairness. Fixing funding inequalities is a long-standing priority within the sector, and it's urgently important. Under an anti-racist approach, the sector would work together to reshape the funding landscape to ensure truly equitable distribution of funding, and this would require organisations to actively challenge practices in public funding and commissioning processes that are detrimental to specialist by and for Black and minoritised and migrant women's organisations. Collaboration. Collaborative anti-racist partnerships look like Black and minoritised women's services being meaningfully involved as co-creators in the design of that arrangement or consortium bid, and not as an add-on or afterthought. Diversity. Black and minoritised women's organisations have unique experience, knowledge, and a core value is to be active in recognising their autonomy and ending the appropriation of their work and subsuming of Black and minoritised women's services into generic services. The next slide, please. On representation, effective and equitable policy practice and decision-making needs Black and minoritised women and by and for organisations to be visible and represented at every stage. White-led organisations dominate the org sector, and as in the wider charity sector, Black and minoritised women are underrepresented in positions of leadership. Our recruitment and progression processes need to be lived and our intersecting experiences and insight should provide opportunities for progression and professional development at all levels. On equality, the values of the Charter commit us to scrutinising and changing organisational practices that lead to Black and minoritised women being excluded from, treated unequally, silenced or sidelined within white-led organisations. Black and minoritised women working within the white-led sector often carry the burden of anti-racism work within their organisations without adjustment for the additional workload and recognition of the emotional toll that this takes on them. Intersectionality, we will centre an intersectional approach within our work and centre the needs of women facing multiple forms of oppression, including due to race, class, faith, immigration status, disability and sexuality. And inclusivity, we will commit to a truly inclusive way which enables the full and equal participation of Black and minoritised women and organisations. I go to the next slide. Now, an anti-racist org sector will not be achieved just through the Charter alone, but the Charter itself also needs to be a living document, needs to be something that's owned by the Charter, by the sector, and the commitments within it will expand, they will develop. But we hope that this process really starts the ongoing commitment, the reflection and the learning that is needed for anti-racism work. And it provides a mechanism for action and accountability within our sector. Now, there are 7 key priority issues that are set out in the Charter, and they're accompanied by a vision of what an anti-racist approach looks like and the commitments needed to get there. The Charter goes into a lot of detail and explains why these specific issues have been identified. In the time I have now, I can't go into lots of detail on all aspects of the Charter, but I will try and summarise some of the main issues for each of the actions. Within funding, principles and commitments to fairness and equality in resources should be developed within the org sector at local and national level between white-led organisations and by and for Black and minoritised women's organisations. There should be a shared statement and vision to funders and government that we need by and for organisations. There are also within funding a number of actions that relate specifically to funding equity, including requesting that funders are asked to explain how they will ensure tendering priorities are inclusive of by and for Black and minoritised women's organisations and needs in those local areas. Look at ways that funders can help to create that equal and level playing field that fully recognise the social value of provision of by and for specialists. On partnerships and collaboration, partnerships should be equitable and ensure that representation and input is there. Work to ensure sector-wide spaces and meetings, both locally, nationally and internationally, include invitations to by and for Black and minoritised women's organisations, and events including seminars, conferences, workshops. They all include the voices of Black and minoritised women. On appropriation, white-led organisations should taking steps to ensure they're not appropriating from by and for services by questioning who is the true owner of this work before embarking on it. Autonomy, participation and leadership of by and for organisations in the work that is best delivered through their expertise and knowledge, keeping to the nothing about us without us principle. On representation and engagement, an anti-racist response involves Black and minoritised organisations being visible and represented, as they have unique expertise and they bring critical analysis of structural inequalities and oppression. Whilst white-led organisations are also active in disrupting power imbalances and ensuring safe space and diversity in decision-making spaces. On leadership and governance, there are many actions in this area. A few of them are developing a best practice approach to monitoring and reporting, including on race pay gaps, representation, recruitment and promotion. Organisations ensuring that they have strategic objectives and the outcomes of their work are based on an intersectional analysis, and that mainstream work of an organisation does not have a differential impact on Black and minoritised survivors. It includes senior management and board members at white-led organisations educating themselves on anti-racist principles and issues relevant to our sector. Black and minoritised women who could contribute to anti-racism work internally within their organisations, having that work valued, including recognising the emotional toll and the workloads being adapted in recognition of these additional demands. The recruitment and progression is anti-racist, so looking at anti-racist practice in striving to achieve equitable representation at every level, including through volunteers, interns, staff, consultants, leadership and board members. There are a huge number of other recommendations within leadership and government, but I'll go on to policy and influencing because I want to cover all of them. Policy, not all of the work done by the sector is frontline. The work that we do at a national level on policy and influencing to build a future free of war can also compound inequalities. It's important to look at this and go beyond gender alone and centre multiple forms of oppression. We should take a do no harm approach to policy development. That means assessing the additional and incidental risks and impacts of policies on Black and minoritised communities, not compounding them through our policy and influencing work. Ensuring that there are meaningful partnerships with by and for organisations, ensuring they are credited and remunerated for their expert contributions to that policy and influencing work wherever possible. And redressing that underrepresentation of Black and minoritised women on platforms and decision-making spaces. So ensuring that Black and minoritised women's involvement and voices are there in events that we organise, and questioning their underrepresentation when we're guests at other events. On communications, the current hostile media environment perpetuates many narratives and stereotypes which subordinate Black and minoritised women. The VORG sector's external communication and awareness raising work does not effectively challenge this always. It doesn't always speak to all survivors, and it's not often accessible to all survivors either. Examples of that include the underrepresentation of Black and minoritised women's organisations in media reporting, the whiteness of imagery surrounding VORG, and the lack of consistent translation of information and support resources within the VORG sector. We need accessible communications and resources for all survivors, We should build that into the process of producing materials at its outset. You can go to the next slide, thank you. I'd say but one brief thing on accountability. It's really important that the VORG sector takes ownership of the organisational and collective work that arises from this charter. It's really important for organisations who sign up to do the work to define and commit to some kind of accountability framework. The values in the call to action can help in guiding the sector to find ways to hold themselves accountable. But the work needs to be truly owned and adopted by individual organisations and by the sector as a whole. It's taken some time to get to this point. I mean, we're concerned as a group with the need to make sure the Charter does not help organisations with just being able to declare themselves anti-racist or anti-racist organisations if they sign up without doing any of that tangible reflection and that necessary work to dismantle the structures of oppression that maintain racism, or even to begin questioning what their own complicity is in maintaining those structures. We want to launch the Charter as soon as we're able to, and we've got fully accessible versions in British Sign Language and easy read. We hope to be able to do this very soon, next month. Following the launch and over the year ahead, we then plan to hold a more in-depth series of workshops to support organisations with their implementation of the Charter, as well as a broader package of work to accompany the Charter, such as tools and resources and work to monitor progress. And as I said before, there's also work going on to expand the membership and structure of the group underway to ensure that we are representative of the VORG sector. And the last slide just tells you who is within the anti-racism working group. It's got our email address and it's got the website there if you want to find out some more information. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And this is like a really pragmatic and practical guide and a way for organisations to truly not only sign up, but to actually structurally change and address the inequalities that are often inherent within many of the structures, the national kind of charitable structures, but also in the violence against women and girls sector as well. But we really want to work in solidarity with organisations. And this charter really enables us to strengthen our work nationally, especially at a time when we're being so divided. We're being divided because of commissioning, because of funding disparities, but also because of the many things that are going on at a socio-political level, as Andrea alluded to. And Andrea, I'm really glad that you mentioned the SOA report that the government produced on racial inequality. And, you know, racism has become really cited now as a cultural phenomenon, hasn't it? You know, it's something that Stuart Hall really warned us against, you know, in terms of the authoritarian nation state adopting culture and heritage as ways to reinscribe racism. And I think that there's a lot of this that's going on in parallel with the actual harm that's being done to Black and minoritized women because of different forms of state legislation, etc., as we know. And something which I think everybody's aware of, but we haven't explicitly discussed, is that we've just had a Domestic Abuse Act passed, which excludes migrant women and women without recourse to public funds. And, you know, we're talking about that level of onslaught that's going on against Black minoritized women. And I think it's something that we all collectively agree within the broader women's sector and the violence against women and girls sector, that is something that we have to rise and resist against in solidarity. So thank you for going through that, Andrea. And hopefully we can discuss this a bit further when we take questions as well. So I'm going to introduce Adwoa, who's our last speaker. An amazing woman from an organisation called Forward, who are equally amazing as well. And Adwoa is going to talk about reflecting on where we are at the minute and also where we're possibly going to be going in the future. And I know she's going to have some incredible insights into that. Adwoa started working as a psychologist in the University of Ghana. She's done frontline work in refuges. She chaired Forward, the organisation she works for at one time. And as many of us know in the sector, what happens is we bring women in through our trustees and boards, and then we just get them to start working in the sector. And I think that very much happened to Adwoa. And then Adwoa has been also working internationally and developing a lot of very credible feminist international projects that have been amazing. And if you don't know Forward, please look them up. They do a lot of work with young women as well. That is really, really important. So I'll hand over to you, Adwoa. Thank you. I think it's that classic thing, you're on mute.
Trying to be efficient. Thank you so much. And thank you for Rosa for this opportunity. One of the things I want to say is this is such a difficult and such a wide concept. I often wonder when organizers come up with a theme like this, how do they anticipate the panelists are going to respond? So in 6 minutes, I'm going to try and discuss forward structure and how that helps us deliver quality appropriate practices and services. Give you a few unique examples of how we ensure that our practice is anti-racist and equitable and just for Black African women. So as Rosa said, I work for Forward, an African women-led international organization, and has been so from our establishment. The issue we started working on was solely seen in those days as an African women's issue for many years after our founder, Ifwa Dokunu, set us up. And in a way, Forward has been an outlier in respect of anti-racism in the workplace. We are unique in that the staff are all female and predominantly African. Our current team are from Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Egypt, Ghana, Uganda, Somalia, India. And unlike most development organizations, the white people who work in our organization are in the minority. Our board reflects the same diversity, although our board does include men. This reflects the Forward ethos that we as African women need to talk about our issues. We do want and do work with allies, but for us it was important that we spoke on our issues. We sometimes describe it in the office as the messenger is sometimes more important than the message. So the women who come in to use our services see women who look like them, speak their language, smell like them, eat, cry, hug like them, who understand the nuances they can't express and validate their lived experiences. When we started on our journey, no one wanted to talk about this particular form of violence against women and girls. So Forward and other African NGOs did the really difficult work to bring FGM out of the shadows and make it mainstream. But sadly, most of the other NGOs have faded into obscurity. I wonder why that is. I just put that and put a pin on that. The racism we faced was the othering of our issue, female genital mutilation. It was something over there done by those people to their girls. Our battle was to have it seen as something that needed to be addressed in the UK and in a manner consistent with other forms of child abuse. Getting the law in place, the first law, was relatively easy. Tory government was very willing to pass the law. Labour supported it. With the legislation in place, we then started making sure that affected girls and women were getting the services and the protections we needed. So we target those sections that provided child protection or safeguarding. And we were trying to get them to see that our girls needed protection in the same way as they would protect little white girls. No more, no less. That was the first hurdle. The fear of being labeled racist made many professionals unwilling or unable to deal with FGM in an objective manner. We found they were either paralyzed into inaction or into frenzied overreaction. And we spent many training hours trying to deal with that angst. We realized also that we needed to work with our own community members to deconstruct those social norms, both at home and in the UK, to provide alternatives to raising daughters as good girls without cutting, but still recognizing that those social norms needed to be uprooted and replaced with social norms that promote equality, but within a context of understanding and respect. 36 years later, we continue to target these groups as staff that have responsibility for safeguarding and child protection do not always have the nuances that are needed to deal with such cases. One step that we took that I would like to highlight as a really good way to developing true anti-racist practice was our work we did with Northwood Park Hospital to establish the first ever in the world Africa Well Women Clinic, which provided an amazing specialist service for women with type 3 FGM. This is a key step to addressing inequality in service provision. Identify a need that the women have and respond to it. The clinic model and guidelines at the height of its use were replicated by 22 other African Well Women clinics in the UK. Even the WHO took it as the gold standard. The majority of these clinics were managed and run by female African midwives who were working excellently at undertaking the defibrillations and the aftercare of women. There were interpreters when they were needed. These midwifery run services were warm, compassionate, non-judgmental, flexible. They were responsive to the needs of pregnant and non-pregnant women, and the focus was on women's needs. There were space for sharing and receiving information and were an excellent example of anti-racist practice. Sadly, over time, the majority of these clinics closed down. They became more restrictive, more doctor-led, more punitive. Forward campaigned against these closures with very little success. But good ideas can't be silenced. In a weird way, the circle has come back round. So the NHS is opening clinics, reopening clinics, but these clinics are now only 8, 5 in London and 1 in Bristol, 1 in Leeds and 1 in Birmingham. So if you're outside London, they are very far apart, creating a barrier to access for the women and girls who need these services. One of the most recent steps that are being touted as increasing protections for girls at risk of FGM came about with the 2015 Serious Crime Act, which introduced safeguarding legislations with regard to FGM. These included expansion of extraterritoriality to include habitual UK residents, lifelong anonymity for victims of FGM, mandatory reporting duty of known cases of FGM, introducing the offense of failure to protect a girl from FGM, and the huge bugbear that we have, which are the FGM protection orders. However, since these protections came into force, there's been no systematic review to see if they are fit for purpose. And what Forward would like to see is a systematic and considered review of all of these introduced protections. For example, since 2015, there have been 480 applications for FGM protection orders, which are orders that are imposed to prevent, protect, and restrict families from performing female genital mutilation. So 480 applications, 676 granted. Now this discrepancy is interesting. Another nugget. Is it because a single female genital mutilation protection order is expanded to cover siblings? Is it because judges on the bench make a decision, even if a social worker hasn't asked for it, for an FGM protection order? We don't know. Are all of these cases being handled in exactly the same way on every bench? Are all the triggers the same? Are they all weighted the same? I mean, one of the questions is, why is it that protection orders are not treated exactly the same? Are they all in place until the girl is 18? But we know that there are cases where in one case, a judge instituted a protection order till the girl was 16 years and 2 months. Why 16 years and 2 months? In another case, it was until she was 17. The interesting thing is, we all know that childhood ends at 18. So why are protection orders not in place until 18? We are not advocating for additional restrictions on young women's freedoms or restrictions on the families. But it would be good to have a system, a principled position that everybody knows exactly what happens. In respect of mandatory reporting, why is FGM being treated in a completely different way to any other form of abuse? Why is it the only abuse that gets reported mandatorily to the police? Is it because it's in pursuit of protections or prosecutions? But if that is the case and they've been reporting, then what? What has happened? There has been no prosecution as a result of mandatory reporting since 2015. Then we've got mandatory recording of FGM. So now every single woman who goes to antenatal, who goes to midwifery, who gets a health visitor, who goes to the GP, if she has FGM, it's recorded on her file. What do we do with that information? We don't know. So as a way of securing racial justice, one of the things that Forward has been doing is using strong evidence. So we've conducted a research talking to affected communities using a participatory evaluative ethnographic research methodology, i.e. talking to the people who are affected and using them as the real researchers and the real, to empower them as part of the research process, asking them about how they perceive and how they are living with the realities of these increased protections. And the findings were very concerning. Families were very aware of the outcomes of these policies. They felt they were always being treated under suspicion, being over-policed, that actions were taken even before investigations were carrying out. Families were living in constant fear that their children would be removed. The police reported they were getting inappropriate referrals from safeguarding professionals. Social workers saw the negative impact of the families. And at the end of the day, even when families went through the process and were cleared, their families had been affected, sometimes permanently. So researchers like this provide the evidence we need to advocate for a systematic review of the legislation and to get the justice that families need while continuing to protect the girls, but not stigmatizing and alienating communities. Another way that we work to achieve justice and provide anti-racist services is to work in partnerships, because we recognize that we can't do it all alone, and that local knowledge, in-depth understanding of communities means you get a more equitable service provision. We also work in partnership to ensure sustainability, building the capacity of partners to articulate their needs and to occupy those spaces and places of power so that they can represent the communities. I would end by saying that delivering anti-racist practice and justice is not easy, and it links in with Andrea's presentation, demanding long-term and critical self-review. But I would also say that just because it's hard doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. The last thought that I would throw in just before we break up this session is that to deliver anti-racist practice means that the organization has to ensure that staff self-care and that the organization itself supports the well-being of their staff, not only because of the COVID crisis, but because of the issues that we are dealing with. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Adwoa. And there's so many layers to this discussion. We've got like 10 minutes for questions now, but isn't this always the way? It's like we need to have these discussions to be part of all of the panels not just, you know, like a panel that's stuck onto the, you know, the general course of a conference. It's not enough, and I think we've only touched the surface. But what everybody is covered is, you know, that role that specialists led by enforced services have in the work that we're doing, not only with the communities that we're supporting, but it's much wider in terms of the impact that we have generally around women's rights. And that this structural inequality that we're talking about, everybody has talked about how that is institutionalized by state mechanisms. Yeah. And that really, for us to be even considering delivering anti-racist practice, or whoever approaches it, racial justice, it goes hand in hand. It cannot be separated. Yeah. And I think this is a thing where it's not a day job. And obviously for the communities that many of us come from, for the women that we support day in, day out, they can't put that on a shelf. The racism and inequalities and the violence they experience cannot be put on a shelf at the end of the day. And I really hope that there is a broader commitment from the sector, but also from other organisations towards really carrying and taking this forward. So a couple of questions, and I want to thank everybody for their comments in the chat. They've been really supportive. Some really great reflections have come through. But a couple of questions have come through. So we've got 9 minutes. So I'm going to ask you to be quite swift in your answers. So somebody asked, what can organisations do to provide continued support after an individual has used the service, when they come from a Black, minoritized or marginalised background? And I think that brings up a question about reflection. And I'm presuming this comes from a kind of white-led structured organisation. So what do you think could be done to provide and continue that support once a woman has gone through an organisation, and how can that organisation reflect? Who would like to come in first? Anybody like to come in first? Okay, Gisela, I can see you. Oh, great, Adwoa.
Yes, in a very good question. I think what we do and what we have done at Forward is to institute what we call coffee mornings, so that even after they finish the service, they can still stay in touch, not only with us, but with other women who share their experiences. And of course, they get linked into joining events and activities, and well, when we start getting together again, face-to-face activities that we hold. But it's about being conscious of and being aware to keep holding the women and girls who come through our service.
Thanks for that. Would anyone else like to come in? And I think you did bring in how difficult COVID's been, because our organisations and our centres have been a haven for so many women. You know, they're the only place of safety often for the women we support. Would anyone else like to come in on that?
Yeah, just a different perspective. For us, one of the ways where we have directed these activities towards activism and helping women doesn't mean that they need to run campaigns, but at least giving them the tools to feel confident to speak about the issues. And we have seen these manifest in really interesting ways. So we have had participants in the activist program who then go on to become leaders in one part of the union they're members of, and then recruit other women to the union and things like that. So it doesn't have to be activism necessarily in the context of the organization and the work that the organization is doing. What we want is for them to say, okay, you want some change, you have the power. We're not giving you definitely any kind of power. If anything, we're facilitating platforms, but on that basis, we're facilitating platforms. We're not empowering anyone, because I think that terminology is disempowering in itself. And we have seen, I mean, it has been really interesting how the participants of the project have taken to this. And one of the things that in the context of COVID, we saw is that they were the link to the community that would bring women experiencing domestic abuse that could not reach the service directly because of the situation they were in during the lockdown to come into the service. And it has been a really positive experience for us.
Thanks so much for that. Dania, would you like to quickly come in?
Thanks. So I just like to say in terms of just, and using the example of the asylum process. So at every point of the asylum process, so we kind of, after a woman uses the accommodation, what we have to be really aware of is that the process is really designed to trigger trauma. So at every point in the asylum process, there are trigger points. So what we do is we ensure that they have access to counseling at any time that they need it. So even though we may not be accommodating somebody, we are with them through the life cycle of their claim. And so whether it's court support and kind of, legal discussing, advocating with lawyers and housing. And so it's a continuing, ongoing relationship. So it's very unlike a kind of market-driven kind of business model where you pay for a service and that's it. This is a different kind of commitment, and it's often overlooked in terms of the energy and the resources that are required to ensure this continuing support. So I just like to say that. So it doesn't end the service.
Thank you for that. That's really, really important. It segues really nicely with our last question, because the difference that Black and minoritized women's organisations bring is that holistic, truly holistic wraparound support, the intensity of the intersectional advocacy that we provide, as well as ensuring, as Gisela brought up, about ensuring that actually part of the recovery is for women to know their rights. We want to empower their social and economic independence as well, which is very thin on the ground. So this kind of links nicely with another question about the disparities in terms of the funding. We've got majoritively white-led, structurally white-led funders, yeah, and then we've got a lot of organisations that we know have been very poorly funded. And there's, and we also know that there's also commissioning frameworks that replicate those kind of inequalities. And very, very few Black and minoritized women's services are funded within the commissioning framework. So I just want to quickly ask you about that and your thoughts on that in the last few minutes, about how we can address those inequalities in a very practical way, because I think that would be very useful for maybe the Black and minoritized organisations that are attending today. Thanks. Who would like to come in first? Dania?
Yeah. So I kind of, in terms of funders, and I think that's a very important question, and thank you for asking it, because I don't think we can paper that over, because one of the things that we are really concerned about is that what we are fighting on the ground and what we are seeing on the ground and the violence that we're seeing on the ground shouldn't be linked to the way in which funding. So it's part. So we really need to be careful about funders kind of, being committed and having kind of skin in the game when they realize that we're trying to do something that's structural, that's transformative. And if the funders themselves are not reflective about their position in perpetuating the structures that we are trying to resist, then that's a problem. And I just want to say that it's not easy, but I think, and there are initiatives by some funders that we work with where there is really, they come to the level at which we are working, and to really map and reflect and hear the voices and to, kind of be more responsive, as opposed to the organizations doing the work having to do that additional labor of trying to, put everything that we do in these prefixed boxes. A packaging that you have to fit this packaging in order to get the funding. So there definitely needs to be reflection and a recognition of the kinds of work that is being done on the ground, and the anti-racist practice on the ground. So I just have to say that.
Thank you. We've got 1 minute left. I mean, this is something that Imkaan's really, really committed to for its members and generally for the sector, is having those conversations with funders, because individual organisations can't, because it could affect their funding. So would anyone else like to quickly come in for 1 minute, 30 seconds?
Just briefly, I'd say that the Charter is really helpful in this exact area when we're trying to hone in on specific actions and different ways of doing things going forward, and that is applicable for organisations within the Borg sector to be more reflective of the way that they work in partnership and in consortium and collaborations with by and for organisations, but also for funders to look at how they're replicating some of those structures which are unfair and which have been sort of instrumental in sort of impacting and reducing the capacity of by and for organisations to not just provide services but just to exist in this climate. So there's a huge amount of specific things that can be taken forward from the Charter on that exact point around funding. And we want to move this work into having those conversations with funders so that they can properly reflect on their role within this and what more they can be doing to provide sort of a level playing field, a more equitable distribution of funding, and ensuring that it is actually reaching specialist by and for organisations in a very real way.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you to everyone, to all of the amazing speakers. And also we've offered up really practical ways that the sector can support us, sign up for the Charter, get involved, move out the way, create space for Black and minoritized organisations, work in equitable partnerships, and support, really importantly, support our racial justice campaigns as well. So I want to say a huge thank you for your time and for all of the commitment that you're doing day in, day out around the rights of Black and minoritized women and girls. And thank you to Rosa for having this panel. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Look after yourselves.
Thank you.
I'd like to echo
Have a good
Rosie's
day.
thanks. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you, Rosie.
Rosie.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.